Today I would like to preach from Luke chapter 1, verse 37 and a half. And if you are very, very sharp and you've had enough coffee this morning, you're probably thinking, Colin, okay, I didn't see verse 37 and a half. Is this some sort of platform 9 3/4 thing? You and your millennial obsession with Harry Potter is really quite getting out of hand now. So let's back up a moment. This Advent, we are exploring what it means to live an evolving faith passed down generation to generation. And usually on the second Sunday of Advent, we are reading about John the Baptist. And look, Baptist Church, we love John the Baptist. But for this Sunday, we're going to leave him out in the wilderness with his camel hair suit and his dinner plate of locusts and wild honey. And we're going to turn our attention to Jesus and his family. Last week, our scripture reading was the genealogy of Jesus. And Pastor Mimi asked us what it would look like if we made decisions factoring in 7 whole generations down the road. Today's story is the Annunciation of Mary, which is just a fancy Bible word for an announcement. The angel Gabriel sought out Mary and told her that she would bear a child, and the child's name would be Jesus, and he would be the Christ, the Messiah, the one who was promised to come to free us from our sin and enact God's peace. No pressure, Mary. And if this Scripture does anything for us, if it does anything at all, it answers the age-old question that we ask every Christmas season. Mary, did you know? Yes, Mary knew. The angel told her. Why do we keep asking this question? That song drives me bonkers. The angel came and told her all these things, and next week we'll be reading a scripture where she sings a whole song about her excitement about knowing all the things. Okay, that's my little rant. But all this brings us up in chapter 1 to verses 37 and 38, where Mary asks, how is it possible that she, a virgin, could conceive? And the angel responds that all things are possible with God. And in her artist statement for Mary's Golden Annunciation, one of the wonderful works here in front of us today, artist Carmel Beaujolin writes, in Mary's yes uttered in her Magnificat, we see the transformation of a young teenage girl from fearful to determined, from simply accepting to deciding, from passivity to agency, from betrothed to surrogate mother of God, an honor rarer than gold. Perhaps the most remarkable annunciation in this passage, she writes, is not the messenger's revelation to Mary, but Mary's yes to the call. And that is why what fascinates me, what I want to imagine with you today, is what went through Mary's head between verse 37 and verse 38, between when Gabriel finishes his pitch, but before she says, yeah, let it be. What was she thinking? I'm sure that Mary's companion in that moment was fear. Perhaps she thought of the risks of carrying a child, something that is still dangerous and difficult today. Maybe she remembered women in her family who had had difficult pregnancies or horror stories from other friends who were moms. Maybe she stood in that moment with the fears of generations laid upon her soul, because our trauma and our pain is passed down in our traditions, in our interactions, in our DNA. She was afraid just the same way her mothers were afraid. Maybe she was afraid for herself, thinking of the possibility of being publicly shamed, of being dismissed from her marriage, of the potential for violence because of this pregnancy. Or she was afraid for her child, knowing, as all parents do, that there would be some point where she could no longer protect her child from all that the world might do. Perhaps Mary knew that her son would refuse to accept oppression and domination. And there are those who stay in power because of oppression and domination, and they tend to look poorly on those who challenge that status quo. So I'm sure that fear was her companion, and I am certain that anger came along for the ride. Because Mary had to wonder if she was being asked to do something that was fair to her. She might have wondered whether it was really a question or a command, whether she had room to consent. And though there is evidence that she did, we should not move past this point too quickly, but be willing to sit with the discomfort that it might cause us. Mary might also have been angry at the idea that she would give birth to the Prince of Peace, because perhaps she was furious with Roman oppression and the Herodian regime. Perhaps she wanted revenge. She would not be the first person in history who did not want peace if it also meant peace for her enemies. Or maybe Mary simply found it all just overwhelming. For there are times when we are afraid, and there are times when we are angry, and there are times when it is simply all too much and we don't know what to do. Mary might have looked at the situation before her and worried that it was hopeless, that it was too big a problem to be changed, something we are familiar with today. I am certain she had trouble imagining what lay before her on that road. And maybe she couldn't imagine that she was worthy of this task that God put before her. For so many of us feel unworthy of love, unworthy to be cared for, unworthy to be appreciated, unworthy to love ourselves, much less be loved by others, much less be loved by God. And here Mary is, discovering that she is not only loved by God, but favored to bear God's child. Maybe she just could not imagine that it was her child who would be the one to bring all of God's promises to being. Maybe all those promises didn't even seem like something she could imagine, because I think we can all imagine the end of one conflict or one war or one argument, but can we really imagine the end of all conflict everywhere? The day when war is no more, when all women feel safe all of the time, when no 12-year-olds get shot down in the street ever again. And if we can't, can we at least trust God to imagine it for us? And trust God to bring it about, even when we find it hard? God had promised to her, God has promised to us, that one day every bond would be broken, all people would live in freedom and dignity. No more would brother turn against brother. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion will feed together, and a little child shall lead them. And here Mary is thinking, her little child. So of course it's too much. Of course it's overwhelming. But all of this, I think, lies in the space between verse 37 and verse 38. And yet, she does not say no, even though there were 1,000 reasons to. She does not say, thank you, sir, get out of town, I'm going to go this way, mind my own thing, do my own deal. She puts her trust in God. And not just her personal God, the God of generation after generation in her family, her found family, her people. Somewhere in that space, I believe she remembered something passed down to her. She drew a sense of hope from old family recipes and warm memories, the feel of her grandmother's shawl, the way her mother hummed when she cooked, the way they laughed when they told stories. She remembered not just the heartbreak of the women in her family, but their courage. She drew strength from Ruth, who dared to believe that she and Naomi would find peace. Bathsheba, who overcame the unthinkable to give birth to kings. Tamar, whose wiles helped her get ahead. And Ruth, who helped bring down, who helped bring down a city. So Mary remembered that she would not be the first in her family to make a new life out of improbable circumstances by walking with God. She was afraid, but perhaps she greeted fear like an old family friend, someone who had visited her ancestors. So she could say, "Hello, fear. You were a guest of my grandmother once, and my mother too. And you were welcome to stay for a short time, but not forever. And you will not rule me in the same way that you did not rule them." Mary remembered what she had learned from her family, that peace can be scarier than conflict if conflict is all you have ever known. If you have grown up on conflict, if you have always been in some sort of fight or conflictual relationship, you may actually feel more comfortable in an uneasy situation than to find peace. And you have to stop yourself from seeking conflict just to feel normal. You have to get used to being at peace. And so Mary remembered that to find true peace means that we must allow God to work in us and transform us even as we seek to transform unjust systems. She remembered in that moment the wisdom passed down to her that peace is not the absence of fear, but the presence of God within fear. That drawing air into your lungs can be a radical act of defiance when the world does not want to let you breathe. That we do not start out with courage, that courage is something we find along the journey when we set out to follow Jesus. I believe that in between these two verses, Mary remembered the stories of God working through unlikely and improbable heroines and heroes, of God stepping into the lives of people who were flawed and messed up in all sorts of ways, and yet became partners in God's work. Stories of God healing the brokenhearted and holding out the promise of dawn to those who thought themselves lost in never-ending night. She remembered that Scripture tells us more about who we are than how to act. That the Bible is not a list of doctrines, but a library of God's encounter with human beings passed down from generation to generation so that we might find ourselves in the ever-unfolding story of God's liberating work. Because of Scripture, we know we belong. Mary could feel in her bones that no matter how scared she was, no matter who she was, she belonged. God was with her, and God's story had not ended, but was unfolding with her. And because of Scripture, you can know that God's story has not ended, but is unfolding with you this moment, this day. This is why we tell these stories every year, every Christmas, all year long. They shape us and they mold us, and we draw courage from them. We draw courage from those who come before. When we seek to make peace at our lowest moments, when we give up hope, we can look to Dorothy Day and Oscar Romero, to Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King, to Wangari Maathai and Nelson Mandela, to the greatest peacemaker of them all, Jesus of Nazareth. This Advent season, we are here to remember. We wait in anticipation for Jesus Christ to be born, even though it happened 2,000 years ago, because we are waiting on a memory of this future that God offers to us. A future of knowing that God is not done with you yet, that you are beloved and you belong, and your future is still open before you. So what happened in verse 37 and a half? Generations of fear and worry met generations of hope and courage, and Mary remembered and she said, "Let it be." So now, let us turn to the great act of remembering that we do together once a month, the act of communion. For as we partake of bread and juice, we offer our entire selves, mind and heart and body and soul, to remember that we are part of God's story and the peace of Christ is still available to us today.